we will be recording this webinar. And as we get towards the end, our presenter will allow time for some questions, suggestions, inputs, whatever. So I want to welcome everybody. Our facilitator today is Dr. Jodi Wilson. She's the owner of Business Psychology Solutions, which is a consulting firm in Southeast Washington, or what many of us know as the Tri-Cities area. She has over 20 years of experience tapping into unseen strengths and developing strategies to optimize organizational talent and leadership. She does use behavioral science to transform organizations, and it makes sense because, guess what? She is a behavioral scientist. She's also an instructor, a coach, and a presenter. She holds a PhD in business psychology and specializes in serving individuals and organizations. Her clients range from small family-owned businesses to Fortune 500 companies. Currently, she's an adjunct professor at Columbia Basin College in Richland, Washington. She teaches at South Puget Sound Community College, and she's also an instructor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. So let me turn the microphone over to our presenter. We had a great session this morning, so I know we're going to have a great hour together this afternoon. Dr. Wilson, the microphone
is all mine. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon. Well, afternoon in my world, and I think probably almost rolling up into the evening on the East Coast. So thank you very much for coming. Today, we're going to talk about the engaged leader, and I am really focusing in on a back to basics approach. When I started looking at employee engagement, one of the things that I was noticing was that there was this concept of gamification, and there were organizations that were trying to create apps in order or different software in order to try and engage employees through these apps. However, I wasn't finding any of the research that was really saying that those were of value, and I wasn't finding that gamification to be occurring in the majority of organizations that I was working with. So through some research, I was looking at how we actually do engage through leadership and engage employees. And I really went back to some of the more foundational elements when it came to employee engagement, so that way we could be looking at how to build the stepping stones and the foundations. It really comes back to a lot of the interpersonal aspects and a lot of communication. So we'll be moving through a few slides today and mostly talking from that very basic foundational perspective. When it comes to employee engagement, one of the big companies that is doing a lot of data collection on employee engagement is the Gallup organization. And in 2013 was when they released the State of the American Employee. And in that report, they talked about engagement and disengagement and having employees who were actively disengaged. They were finding that there were different categories of engagement and disengagement. And they were also finding through their research in 2015, when they reported the State of the American Manager, that 70% of the variance in employee engagement is attributed to managers in the workforce. So basically what it comes down to is that the variation or the statistical output was also related to the level of engagement that managers had in relation to their employees also. So when a manager has a high level of engagement, they're more likely to have a team that works under them that has a higher level of engagement. If the manager has a lower or a moderate level of engagement, then the employees are likely to match that. When we're looking at employee engagement, there are three major categories that I ran into through my research. So as we're reading different articles or we're running into different perspectives that people have about employee engagement, it's really important to keep these perspectives in mind because they're kind of the vantage point or the viewpoint that people are looking at employee engagement through. One of the the categories is burnout antithesis. So really and honestly, burnout antithesis is really also about retention and trying to make sure that you are retaining your employees by not burning them out or not overworking them versus trying to let them kind of coast through, so to speak. When you're looking at burnout antithesis, you're also looking at one of the most valuable statistics in retention, and that is that if you interact with your coworkers, saying hi with your employees, having a face-to-face contact with them is really important. Getting to know them and having those, even if they're brief, moments where you are interacting with your employees has a large impact on your retention. So in order to increase retention by 20%, having face-to-face conversations are really important. This includes those people who are working on virtual teams. So when you have a virtual team, what I noticed in working with companies that are worldwide or that have a lot of virtual work, I've noticed that they won't turn the camera on. And so when they're not turning the camera on, we have a tendency to still be able to do something behind the scenes. We're not necessarily fully engaged. We're not making eye contact even through the camera to be able to engage the person on the other end. So one of the strongest recommendations I have is that even in a virtual team, turn the camera on, be able to make that eye contact and to see your audience, to see who you're talking to, because it is important to keep that interpersonal connection, and that's one very simple strategy that can help folks. When we're looking at other categories, we're looking at the need-satisfying approach. And in the need-satisfying approach, these are individuals where you're really looking at individual involvement and a level of satisfaction and enthusiasm for the work that they do. So the idea behind engagement is really about, is their job satisfying? Do they have a high level of job satisfaction? No, I'm not saying that word. Being satisfied with work. Satisfaction, there we go. Is there a high level of satisfaction at work? Do they have a high level of enthusiasm for the work that they're doing? When we look at the research coming out of the need-satisfying approach, a lot of it is related to this field of psychology called positive psychology, where they're really focusing in on the positive aspects of work, of feeling like they have a purpose, feeling as though they are engaged in work that is meaningful to them and that they enjoy. So when we're looking at the need-satisfying approach, we're looking at employees having a need and wanting to feel satisfied in that need. And we're also looking at them really performing the work with a level of satisfaction and a level of enthusiasm. When one of the kind of interesting things that's happening in the workforce and some progressive organizations are moving to is they're moving into utilizing job development where employees are developing their jobs and they're leaving out undesired activities. This is a part of the engagement philosophy where it's making sure that people are tending to the parts of their work that they really appreciate and that they really feel valued in, and also taking out those activities that, may really only take 15 minutes, but because the employee doesn't like it, they'll spend 2 hours trying to force themselves to do something that really only takes 15 minutes. That tends to be a challenge for folks. We're seeing more of that happen in like agile organizations where they're like, okay, well, if you don't want to do that work and somebody else wants to do that over here, then we can kind of swap things out. And they're taking away some of those activities that are less desirable for folks. Now, you may find that challenging if you have more than one person who doesn't want to do a specific task, and figuring out who's going to take one for the team and really step in and do an undesirable task. But that aspect or the premise behind that is that it's easier to keep people engaged rather than having somebody struggle for 2 hours to complete something. and letting somebody else take that over and do that for the 15 minutes and really keeping people on that productive flow at work, that also helps with the need satisfying approach. So in the I just messed up. That was the satisfaction engagement approach. The need satisfying approach is the investment in of self in work. So the relationship between the employee and their work is really important for folks. They really want to be able to be identified as a part of their work. One of the examples that I used previously was about nurses. And in the nursing atmosphere, you will see a lot of times folks will really identify that they are a nurse, and they really appreciate and like doing things that are helpful for people, that make people feel good. They do a lot of that tending to people's needs and doing a lot of nurturing and caring for people. When you're looking at this is actually the need satisfying approach. When you're looking at the need satisfying approach, those people have that as part of their identity. And so that ability to identify as part of the engagement process helps them to stay engaged. It helps them to identify and see themselves as part of a contribution, or as the person that they are being valued where they're going to be. When we're looking at engagement, engagement is very delicate. It's not, and it's fragile. There tends to be a need for some level of resiliency. So when we are in a situation with engagement, if we do something to undermine someone's engagement, it's also really important that we pull back and allow them to have the opportunity to have the resiliency to step back up and step into the situation. If we're doing things that are disengaging for our employees and we don't give them that opportunity to step back in, or we just expect it to constantly be on, then we're misusing or misunderstanding the engagement process, and making sure that we give them that opportunity to refresh their desire to engage again. I got myself a little bit off here. So when we are talking about the need satisfying approach, the major point of that is that for need satisfying, it is about their identity and the investment of their self, who they identify as in their engagement process. For the satisfaction engagement process, that's where we have the positive psychology element, and that's where we are looking at developing jobs that are leaving out the undesirable activities. The satisfaction engagement approach is really where the individual's involvement and level of satisfaction and enthusiasm for work is a key component. So when we look at engagement, one of the key pieces that we love to talk about with engagement is actually motivation. And motivation can be pretty tricky because it's actually an emotion. And when we think about emotions at work, one, we don't typically like to talk about being emotional at work. However, motivation is one emotion that we do want people to have while they're working. And when we look at motivation, there's this newer equation that they're calling the total motivation equation. And on the positive side of motivation, we have the three builders of motivation. So we have play, purpose, and potential. If we're writing this out as like a math equation, it would be play plus purpose plus potential equal motivation. So those are the pieces that actually build motivation. They increase motivation. They allow people to feel like they're in the flow at work and they're moving forward and gaining something from their work. The interesting part when we talk about play is we're actually not talking about the places that have, foosball tables and slides in them. We're talking about the perspective of the work that people are doing. Some people, when they are doing work, will find the work so enjoyable that it feels like play to them. And one of the really good examples about that is, think of your Wall Street workers. The people who are going into the stock market and making the exchanges, they enjoy that. For them, it's like a game when they are doing the whole buy, 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 sell, sell, sell. They enjoy that because it has a level of play for them, even though for other people, that is not their version of play. When we're looking at purpose, we're looking at how does someone fit into the organization? How do they fit into the mission of the organization? What role do they have? When somebody has a sense of purpose, they feel like they are fulfilling something. We were talking earlier about volunteers. Volunteers will have a really high sense of purpose if they are connected with an organization that means a lot to them. So if you're talking about an organization that really advocates for animal rights or advocates for children's services, that sense of purpose is that essentially who they are and what they bring to the table is bigger than themselves, and it adds to either the organization or adds to the community. Another example of purpose, if we looked at somebody who had a very high passion for green energy and they went into a workforce or a job site that really fed into that, and they were able to take their skills and make their skills support the higher purpose or support the higher mission of an organization focused on green energy. That's where purpose comes into play. For many people, potential is another additive. It has another additive effect for motivation. So in potential, the thing to remember is that not everybody wants to become a leader or a manager. Potential also has to do with people wanting to gain more knowledge in their current job roles or gain more experience in their career. It's kind of like when you take that, there's a T symbol that talks about like the breadth of knowledge versus the depth of knowledge. In potential, we're really doing things to focus on helping people gain either their breadth or their depth, depending upon what the person is really interested in. At one point in time, I was contracted with a company to come out and work with them on some retention issues. And in the interviews, one of the pieces that I had heard from someone was that in the training programs that they had been offered through their work, that the training programs really didn't add that much value. So they would go to the training the first year and they thought it was great the first year. But then the second time that they had to go to the training, there wasn't any more depth that was added to it over time. So it just felt like for them it was a waste of time because they weren't adding to their own knowledge base and they weren't able to really feel like they were getting more roots into their workforce or into their career like they had wanted to. So really when we're looking at potential, we're looking at letting somebody grow either in the depth of their knowledge or in the breadth of their knowledge. Now, our other side of our balance here in our equation is the economic pressure, inertia, and psychological pressure. These work on the negative side. So these are all of the minuses, so to speak. If you are looking at economic pressure from a total motivation equation, economic pressure can come into play through things like organizations that can have a high rate of layoffs. They can have the potential to be bought out, or like they have a division of a whole company that's set up and ready to go for sale. That has a level of economic pressure for people who are working for them. And then when we look at that economic pressure, we also look at individuals have a different level of risk for uncertainty. So in certain organizations and in certain job fields, you will find people who will have a higher tolerance of working for organizations that have high layoff risks. Other people will not. Anytime they start hearing the hubbub that a layoff could be coming, they're like out instantly. It actually has a lot to do with their risk tolerance and whether or not they find the level a level of comfort in having an organization that has change to it, or an organization that has a higher level of stability. It really and honestly goes back to that person and how that person perceives the risk, and what comfort they have with different risks that are equated with workforces or with different organizations. I'm going to slide down here to psychological pressure for a second, because psychological pressure is the piece where we have those outside influences that also have to do with things like your family, and how we talk about the sandwich generation, where you have a group of people who are trying to raise children plus manage aging parents. So they're kind of caught in this middle where there's a lot of pressure on them and lots of stressors that may not have to do specifically with the job itself, but may have to do with outside influences. Now, some jobs do have a lot of psychological pressure to them. So think about things with different jobs that have high levels of risk. That's a level of psychological pressure. If you have a job that has a high rate of burnout, that's also going to be a psychological pressure that you need to be aware of in the motivation equation. Another piece that we are going to be looking at is this concept of inertia. And I'm going to actually go through a couple of slides first and explain more about inertia. So here's a couple of pictures about our play, purpose, and potential. When you're doing your work and you feel like you're, a little kid, super happy and having a good time and just enjoying life, it is okay to have work that is of that category. I know it's kind of a misnomer for some folks, because they grew up with well, you don't have to be happy. It's a job. You just need to do it. Nowadays, we find that people really don't want to just have jobs as much as they want to be able to engage and feel like they have this positive experience in their workforce. So these are some of the cute pictures that I found that I thought really supported what we were talking about. On the disengagement side, where we're looking at the psychological pressure and the economic pressure and inertia, inertia is known in physics. So inertia is really what starts in motion, stays in motion kind of a thing. When we're talking about inertia from a behavioral economics perspective, inertia is about effort tax. So it's really about the amount of effort it would take to do something different. When somebody is dealing with inertia but is disengaged, it's far easier for them to just keep going with the flow than it is for them to say, whoa, wait, I'm not interested in doing this anymore. It takes a lot of effort for them to do things like build a resume or start getting their name out there if they're in a job that either doesn't match them or that they have no interest in anymore. So inertia kind of keeps us in this place of disengagement, because it's just easier to stay disengaged or to stay at the level that we are at rather than making any changes. The effort that it requires to even make a small change sometimes feels like you're, climbing Mount Kilimanjaro versus actually just taking one step to the left. So the next piece for us is the leader-member exchange. I really like leader-member exchange because it does take us back to those foundational elements with leadership and with management. When we're looking at the leader-follower dynamic, I have found that it's really interesting in a lot of the research that I've read on leadership that sometimes they're really not even talking about followers. They're just assuming that a follower is going to follow if you do certain things, versus actually taking the time to find out if people will follow. And one of the big, what's the word that I want to use? Kind of like a hullabaloo right now. One of the big disruptions in the leadership community right now is that post-World War II leadership isn't working anymore. So we're having to make a lot of changes in how we see leadership, because people aren't instantly following like they once were, and they're not reacting to leadership in the same way that they once were too. However, even though we have these changes coming, there are still pieces that foundationally we need in leadership. And with the leader member exchange, we really look at how to create what they call literally exchanges. But the basis of leader member exchange is the law of reciprocity. And so the law of reciprocity is really about, if I do something for you, you do something for me, correct? So when I, as a worker, go ahead and make sure that I have the agenda written for the next meeting and that I'm prepared to lead my portion, and I have already gone out and started reaching out to other people and saying, hey, I took care of this part. You want to check the document, see what you think before we have the meeting. The law of reciprocity says after I've done that, that you're more likely to then be like, oh yeah, here, I'll chip in my part, and then you move forward and you take care of your portions. So it's that piece that says, if I do something for you, then you will do something for me. When we're looking at the law of reciprocity, the other piece we look at with kind of the work community is this thing we call a psychological contract. And in the psychological contract, what we see is that at work, people engage in work for an exchange, right? So if I'm going to go to work, I don't have a written agreement all the time or a written contract that always says, if I do this, then you're going to do this. Typically when you're a consultant, you do, but in other places, you have your job description, but it's usually pretty vague and it doesn't say what the exact exchanges are. In the psychological contract, you can have an unwritten agreement between you and your supervisor or you and your leader that simply says, you know what, if I go ahead and prep the meetings this way, then you will go ahead and support me with a good performance review, right? And the performance review may then tie into money. But if you kind of renege on your portion of the psychological contract or breach that, employees don't take kindly to it. That's one of the pieces where you will see people start to disengage and they'll start looking for other places of employment. I had a colleague or a gentleman that I had worked with, and he was really working hard with an organization to grow and develop some competencies within the organization. And he went to, his supervisor and he said, I want to take this to the next level and I want to start this program. Went through, built a whole lot of information, came up with a design for how to help out. And then the division that they were going to start the program with decided they didn't want to participate. And in deciding that they didn't want to participate, it got a little ugly. And they ended up in a situation where they were really devaluing the person who was actually trying to help them improve their quality and improve competency. And so in that, what ultimately ended up happening was this person decided that they needed to start looking for other work, and literally we're sitting there talking and he's like, they broke the psychological contract. I was trying to make sure that they did something that made them more competent, that made them, they gave them a higher quality of work that they could do, or higher quality of performance, higher quality of product. And they weren't willing to do that. And for me, that was part of my contract. So they ended up losing this person who really would have been a high asset to them. And maybe they could have couched it a different way and said, hey, let's only start this. Maybe the program was just too intense to begin with, and they could have done something to kind of do some internal marketing to help it along. But that didn't happen. And in the process of that not happening, they lost someone. With the leader member exchanges, one of the other pieces that we have found is that the style of leadership is not dependent on your exchanges, but the exchanges are important for any style of leadership. So by that, I mean, you can be someone who espouses servant leadership, but if you don't do the exchanges, then you really aren't creating that leader-follower dynamic. You can be somebody who believes in transformational leadership, but one of the pieces that we have found is that when you're a transformational leadership, if you're trying to inspire somebody, but you haven't figured out how to help them get their paycheck, or that they keep having issues with something with their payroll or their vacation time, you're more than likely not going to inspire them. Some people look at those lower level pieces, or not, I wouldn't say lower level, some of those smaller exchanges as transactional leadership. And really and honestly, when we look at the full range leadership, we're looking at how those transactional pieces actually build and allow us to get to those transformational pieces. So it is really important that you do well with those transactions, that you are able to do the whole, okay, I've got it. Let me make sure that your vacation time is completely approved. And then we're okay. You can go ahead and go out of town. But if you're somebody who dismisses that, or if you have a leader who dismisses that and treats it as though it's not very important, that has that breach with the psychological contract and the LMX. So you want to be sure that you're getting those smaller exchanges and getting those correct, because that builds the relationship. Those are those opportunities where you start building trust with your employees. And if you're not building trust, what are they in there for? You know, some people do the whole, I'm here to collect a check and I'm okay with that. And most people aren't willing to just collect a check anymore. They can collect a check from anywhere. So what would make your organization special enough to keep them if they're just there to collect a check? Let's see, I think we've got everything in that section. And we can, Gary Coleman. If anybody remembers Arnold Jackson from Different Strokes, I really love this slide, because as we were just talking about with LMX and really working on kind of starting those exchanges and getting the trust built with individuals, I like this, because usually when I see somebody giving a side eye, that means that there's a low level of trust in the organization. So when you have employees or you're having meetings, start paying attention to the interpersonal skills. When we have this slide is named Social and Emotional Intelligence, because in emotional intelligence, there's 12 different competencies. And one of the competencies that's going to be key for employee engagement is really the interpersonal skills, and being able to read the nonverbals and to be willing to watch for the nonverbals. And right here, when, you know, if anybody ever watched Different Strokes, you would hear him say, "What you talking about, Willis?" So when he gives that side eye and he does the whole, "What you talking about?" he's questioning. He doesn't know 100% if he really agrees with you or if he really trusts what you're saying. When we're looking at this from the employee and management perspective, it's important to understand that workers need to feel like they can trust their managers and that they trust their expertise and that expertise comes in the level of looking at both behaviors and emotional and technical support. So when you have managers, workers who feel they can trust managers' knowledge and expertise report higher levels of engagement. To sustain the positive employee engagement, the supervisor or the manager has to exhibit behaviors that show emotional and technical support, as well as a genuine concern for the employee. When we're looking at the emotional and technical support, it can be something so simple as, "Hey, this just went down on a program, a software that I've been working on. Who do I go to help me figure out how to get this back up and rolling?" Well, you go to the boss and the boss is like, "Call Joe." I don't know. I don't have any idea. Just call Joe. If that is the only piece of support that they offer, that's really not going to keep the engagement going. If they are a manager who says, "Hey, start with Joe. I have this meeting and I'll be back. I'll come back around and double check with you about 1:00 and see where you guys were at. I'll also make a phone call to Sue and see if she knows anything about it," and they can help kind of triage, or they can add additional support to to the scenario or to the situation, that's going to increase your engagement. But if if the supervisor is the kind who is just like, well, go call this person and see what they can do, and they don't help triage, that really leads to more of the disengagement versus continuing engagement with employees. As we're going through and looking at some of the emotional intelligence pieces and some of the social intelligence, we also want to stay very aware of our nonverbal communication. This also ties into, believe it or not, your organizational culture. What your organizational culture promotes, what it reinforces, is really important as a key component along with the nonverbal communication and along with the social and emotional intelligence. I say that because I've been in meetings where I have seen people who, one person has an idea for how to fix a complex problem. They're kind of problem solving it out along with the group. And you have this one person in the meeting who's sitting there, their eyes are rolling, they're sighing deeply, they're talking over other people. All of those nonverbals really indicate that the information or what the person is trying to produce, what the person is trying to encourage or talk about is unwelcome, that they don't want it. They don't want to hear that person's opinion. They don't want to know what that person is saying. They strictly want to listen to their own ideas. Sometimes I've run into it where that's the person who thinks they're the smartest one in the room. Every now and then we have those. As the manager, though, it's really important not only that you pay attention to your own nonverbals, but that you pay attention to the nonverbals on the team. In a team situation, you really want to take a minute to pull that person aside and have a conversation and coach them through, hey, when we're in team meetings, it's really important that we kind of hold a space where we take in other people's perspectives, other people's information, and we withhold any kind of negative nonverbals until after we're done, that's just not the place for this. At this point in time and at this point in our problem solving, we really need everybody's input. You would be surprised at how disengaging it can be for people on a team to have one member of the team who kind of acts out like that. I have seen people who have really good ideas and who are very knowledgeable completely shut down and refuse to share any information because the nonverbals that are happening are so unwelcoming and so, some of it's flat out rude, but they're so devaluing to the other people on the team that they're not willing to put themselves out there. They're like, okay, well, if you think that you've got it, you go right on ahead and show everybody how smart you are. But it's really and honestly after that meeting is when they'll go have other meetings and try and come up with another solution. But you want to have an environment where people do feel like they can come forward and they can talk and they can share. It really encourages that sense of purpose and potential, and it encourages the added value that every employee wants to contribute to the workforce that they're in. As we're sitting here looking at pictures, I actually can proudly say that I have not had a manager do the whole hand up, not listening piece. But I have seen things like people come into a manager's office who reports that they have an open door policy. Okay, the door is open. But the manager, when somebody comes in, doesn't look up from their computer. They just keep clicking away at the computer and won't look away from their screen to say, hey, how can I help you? They just, yeah. Okay, that's not a very engaging way to make employees feel like they are welcome or to feel like they have a contribution to be made. It's really those subtle things as a manager that are important to starting the engagement process, cultivating the engagement process, and keeping the engagement going. If you are, you know, an employee who comes in and you're like, hey, this is an open door policy, but I can't actually get your attention when I'm in your office. Your open door policy really isn't that open. The door literally may be open, but you as the manager or that person as the manager may not be engaged, and they're sending a double message. So when you, as the manager, if somebody comes into your office, you can say something like, hey, I'm in the middle of finishing this right now. Can I circle back with you in 20 minutes? Or I have like 3 meetings, but I still would like to circle back with you at 2:30. Even having the ability to stop in that moment and say, okay, just let me finish this one sentence, and then moving away from the computer screen to say, okay, what can I help you with? And giving that person, you know, some undivided attention, letting them know that in this moment, what they have to say and what they're trying to contribute is important. That is part of the engagement process. If we go back to those 3 original categories, each of those categories indicate, and along with motivation, they all look at how do we cultivate potential? How do we cultivate somebody's desire to do the work that they're trying to do? Nothing's going to make your work feel less desirable than having somebody kind of do the whole, well, you're not that important right now. I don't need to talk to you. It may not be an emergent situation, and that's where the manager needs to really triage the situation and be like, okay, so this is more emergent for me right now, and I'm going to tell you, hey, I can come back to you in 20 minutes, but I really have to finish this. Or, you know, I've worked in an office before where when the door is closed, that means that we can't go in and interrupt. But if the door is open, then that means that they are willing to be interrupted in that moment. So it may be more of a compromise and figuring out, okay, right now the manager can't be disrupted because they do have something that's of a high priority versus being able to be interrupted, or doing an email and the manager not getting back to the person for another 2 days because it wasn't as high of a priority to them as what it may have been to the employee. So really looking at how those nonverbal pieces create a unwelcome and unwanted environment for employees is really important. One of the reasons why I picked the pictures that I picked on this one, I really like this second row, the very last one on the right. If you look at the faces, the woman, she's got this look like, no, she's not going for it. And if you look at the gentleman on the right side, he's got this kind of like, I don't know, look on his face too. Those are all signs of disengagement, along with some of the more blatant signs that we have up with these pictures. So when we are doing nonverbal communication, we really want to be sure that we are creating a welcome and wanted environment for employees. If an employee is being tasked with giving a manager a report, and they give that manager the report month after month after month, and the manager in a meeting says, well, I sure wish that I could have this information so that way I knew what decision to make moving forward on this project. And the one person who's been writing the report every month over and over looks at him and says, yep, I've given you that information. You need, as the manager, to be able to at least look at the information and to be able to say, hey, I know you give me this report, but I'm not understanding how this would fit. Or is there a way that the information, regarding the variance of cost would actually be helpful over here when we're trying to make this decision? Engage people with the work that they do. Being sure that you, as the manager, are welcoming their information and are looking at it as though it has some value. Making sure that people are being treated as though their contributions matter also help to create that welcome and wanted environment. When we're looking at using the nonverbals, we're also looking at things like making sure you have that eye contact. Now, granted, you don't want to stare somebody down, but in the same respect, you also want them to know that they have your undivided attention. And And it doesn't necessarily have to be a 2-hour conversation. It can simply be something that takes all of a minute, but it means more to the employee than what we realize if we're devaluing or dismissing them by not looking at them. When we're creating these welcome and wanted environments, we're also making substantial compliments. So we're noticing things like, I noticed that you stayed late on Thursday night to finish that report, and I know that you had other things that you needed to do for your family, but I really appreciate you taking the time to stay that little extra bit. That is going to go a long way with an employee versus just being like, well, it's part of your job. If you got to stay late, that's your problem. That's going to disengage an employee. So letting the employees know that they're adding value, that through the work that they do and through the person that they are, that they have value to you as an employee, as a contributor, as someone who you want to work with on a regular basis. I've seen one of the examples that I used earlier today in the presentation this morning. There was a gentleman who was a great numbers guy, and he was also not your typical numbers guy, so he would interact with folks versus kind of staying back, and like there's another guy in the organization that people just didn't want to go talk to because he would grunt at them. Like you go and ask him a question and he'd be like, what? And so there was this other gentleman who he was also one of the numbers guys, and he would interact with people, and the employees themselves really appreciated him. But when he took another job, the boss was like, oh, well, I really liked the way that he did that, versus, hey, I really appreciated how, he was interactive. It was easy to talk to him. Plus, he did a great job with the numbers. So it's really letting people know that as the person they are and as the work they contribute, that both of those pieces are important and need to be supported and value expressed for both of those, in addition to the appreciation. So I'm trying to make sure that as I wrap up here, that I hit all of the aspects that I really wanted to hit on. One piece back here with the social and emotional intelligence and talking about that transition of leadership from the World War II leadership to nowadays. One of the pieces that they're also talking about is that everybody really doesn't want to be inspired by their boss. They're not looking for the kind of rah piece. If you engage them as their personal mission being a part of their purpose, that is enough for them versus needing some of these kind of bigger fanfared kind of elements of transformational or inspired leadership. Being careful in your leadership style to make sure that you're not too optimistic. When I say that, what I mean is that there's been a push, it seems like, for folks to be really optimistic and telling everybody that no matter what, it's all going to work out and be great and wonderful, even when it's not. And what happens when there's an inflated amount of optimism from leadership is that people they end up not trusting the leader. They end up not trusting what they say, and essentially, on some levels, it can come across as gaslighting. So it comes across as, oh, well, no, it's not really that bad. Okay, well, 25% of your workforce left. What's really not bad to you? When you're looking at aspects that say, we've got a problem here, and they're saying, no, it's not a problem. That heightened level of optimism can actually deflate and disengage your workforce, because it's a matter of taking them seriously and a matter of recognizing that if they see something as a concern, that it's worth it to address that concern too. I think overall we have made it through the end, and I hit all of my major points. So if there's any questions, please feel free. I went ahead and the last slide has a little bit more about some trainings and how to contact me if anybody has questions that they would rather ask one-on-one, or if you have any interest in any of the additional trainings. Did anyone have any other?
I'm sorry, I was talking and I was muted, which is not all bad. But no, I want to ask people, I've got everyone unmuted, and we've got some time for some questions and comments and input. So who would like to step up to the microphone? It's always a shy group, I swear to goodness.
Hey, this is Lori Hammer. I just want to thank Jodi Wilson for doing this today. She always does a great job.
Thanks, Lori. I'm glad you listened in.
You know, Lori, as you were chatting, right towards the end, I suddenly remembered an engagement seminar I went to a few years ago, and it was more along the lines of an employee being engaged versus the leader being engaged. But the whole premise was that engagement is always a choice. Mm-hmm. And people choose to be engaged because they feel like there's a place to grow. They feel like they are respected. They enjoy coming to work. They have a best friend at work. All those things that those of us who are leaders and managers can really work to foster. Those are the things that impact the employee's choice to be engaged. And that whole thing came about because of someone saying that, I need to go to make sure our employees are engaged. We need to demand engagement. And I'm like, oh, please God, you can't demand that.
Yeah, and that's where burnout antithesis comes into play big time, because when you start demanding it, then you actually create an opportunity for burnout. I one time worked for an organization, and I was a counselor then, and we had to have 100% productivity. So we had to bill out 100% of our time. And that meant that there was very little interaction for us collegially, or if we were having issues and needed to find out different resources for a client, we had very little time to actually spend finding those pieces out. And there was a really high level of burnout in that organization.
Wow. With so many of our NMA members being contracted, in contracted situations, if not as individuals, their companies are. That would be an interesting study.
Yeah. Well, there's also a lot out right now about the pay for performance piece. They essentially found out that that's creating more levels of disengagement than it is engagement. And that there's also, in the business world, or the business research world, they like to talk about organizational citizenship, and they also like to talk about counterproductive work behaviors. And they found that in these high pay for performance kinds of jobs, that you actually have some counterproductive behaviors. They found that there are people who actually are fudging their timesheets, or who are fluffing their hours, because the pay for performance and the drive and the pressure. So we're talking about the psychological pressure and the economic pressure on that total motivation equation. The pressure is driving them to make poor choices.
And do you find that engagement from the managers from the get-go with employees like that makes them more, or helps them to be more engaged, more active, and more appreciative of what they're being able to do and how they're being recognized for what they're doing?
Right. Having some other level of recognition besides just the performance number is really important, because otherwise people feel like they're just filling in a slot and that there's no added value for them. It's really about how much money can I make for this company.
Yeah, and I liked what you said about active communication, with where a manager is dealing with a burnout situation and just saying hi to employees and being social with them not just in the workplace, but even potentially beyond that. I find in my organization that is much more productive.
It is.
Each other as humans
Right.
instead of just working machines.
Correct. Yep, exactly. So when we're looking at work, we really want to make sure that we're humanizing work and that we're not putting people into cubicles to keep them from interacting with other individuals, and that we're supporting some of those interactions so that they know they're valued.
Yeah, that seems very key, that people know their value.
Right.
So
And
I
it
should
doesn't-
probably, I was going to
Okay.
say, I should probably stop chaining Robin and Sue to their desks here. Is that
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Oh, okay. I think I got it.
Okay, they
sorry.
won't hit you as much.
Jodi, I interrupted you. Go right ahead.
No, that's okay. I honestly lost the thought at this point. It's all good.
But Jodi, I appreciated, this is Glenn Button, the
thank you.
comment that you made about valuing both the person and the work that they do, the contribution that they make, because
Right.
some of us are naturally inclined toward the technical, getting the work done. Some of us are naturally inclined toward being the people person that we might be, and to be intentional about addressing both sides of the employee. That's really appreciated.
I actually had somebody that I was working with a few years ago, and we had to schedule it. So we had to have her put into her schedule, okay, to make sure that I connect with this person. So because she was a very technically minded person, it didn't come natural for her. So she literally kind of had to create the scheduled alert, and it would remind her, and that prompt was all she needed. And it really and honestly helped her and her team. And it didn't take her very much time. It was maybe 15 minutes, in the whole day or in a whole week that she was spending, but it made a huge difference and a huge impact with the people she was working with.
This is Steve again, and something came across the email chain between your morning meeting and this afternoon session, and it was about how to stay professional through a personal crisis. So I looked at that when I got back after lunch, and it dawned on me how that relates to what you're talking about. As a boss or a manager or a leader, if you know an employee has a personal situation, maybe a spouse has a really nasty diagnosis, or there's some other kind of family crisis going on, my guess would be you really need to work that to help that employee through it on the front end, have some front end discussion. I mean, let me toss it to you. I'm not the expert.
So when you're looking at staying professional in a personal crisis, it's really about having, being human, but having those professional expectations too, and marrying them together. I think in the morning time, we talked about if you, there was a gentleman who was undergoing a lot of extensive tests for cancer. And when he went to his first level manager and said, hey, I'm going to need to be taking some time off in order to, get these tests taken care of. He didn't want to make a big deal about it, but he needed the manager to know. They were taking it up a level and to the director. And when they were taking it to the director, they literally, the supervisor literally had to look at the director and say, I need you to stop and I need you to pay attention to this because it's really important. So that employee could explain, this is the situation, I'm going to be needing extra time off, and it is related to a health crisis. Taking that moment where you don't really want to intrude in people's lives and you want them to be able to keep the private pieces that they want to keep private, but being able to, check in on somebody and do the whole, I haven't seen you for a while, or I haven't heard anything, how are you doing? Those little tiny check-ins can be important, and doing the whole, I don't want to intrude, but please let me know if there's anything that I can do to support you. Is there anything that I can do to make sure that, you have the time off that you need? You have different organizations where people, like having a supervisor who would facilitate getting somebody the time off that they need, even if it means going to the pool. If you've had people who, there's one organization that I worked with where you could pool your hours and donate them to somebody who was sick. Those pieces are really important as the manager and as the leader, that you help facilitate without being intrusive, and really knowing how to say, you know, I just want to make sure that you're okay. I don't want to intrude. You know, I'll let you take the lead with how much information you're willing to share, but please know that it is important to me that I know that you're safe, that you're okay. Those types of things.
Cool. Thank you. Unless anybody else has anything, we probably should wrap this up so we can all get back to work. Anybody have any last minute thoughts? All right. Well, I want to thank Dr. Jodi Wilson for a splendid day at NMA. She's done 2 great webinars. I've been watching everybody staying engaged, and it's been a great time. So, Jodi, thank you again, and I'll give you the last word here.
Thank you for having me. I always enjoy speaking to the folks with NMA, and if you have any need to reach out and ask me some additional questions, please feel free.
All righty. Thank you, and you and everyone else have a great weekend.
All right. Bye.